I've been in Siberia and I saw macaws playing in the snow and they had a heated aviary. You use a down comforter, you use a down filled coat. Birds can tolerate tremendous cold.
Welcome back to the Gray Journal. So, today we have a very special guest, someone that has dedicated over 47 years of his life to aviculture. He's bred almost 82% of all parrot species and has studied and seen over 87% of all parrot species in the wild. He holds the first breeding of the slender billed conure. And in Spain at Laurel Park, he was the first to breed the Bodine's Amazon, the Spix macaw, the red speckled Amazon, the Gang cockatoo, the fiery shouldered conure, and the Kia parrot. I'd like to introduce you to the one and only Tony Silva.
Thank you.
Tony, it's so great to have you on. Thanks for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. Aviculture, I started out as a kid. My father kept and bred canaries and pigeons. My grandmother kept pigeons. My great grandmother had parrots. So I always
Okay,
feel that it's in my genetic code. And I feel that if we don't share our knowledge,
mhm,
we're doomed. Before we got on the program, we were discussing an experience that I had with a teacher yesterday at the post office, and she has
right,
special students, special needs students, and she was saying, the internet does not have the same experience for these kids as having contact with a living animal.
right.
And if we do not fight for that right to keep animals, we will eventually have only species on the internet. It'll be on YouTube and everything else, and no contact. So my mission on a daily basis is to encourage pet keeping.
And
And
that's a beautiful thing. And just seeing what you do on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, I mean, what you do is it'll be remembered forever. You're really pushing
it
it forward.
I'm working on a cockatoo book, and I just came
Mhm.
back from South America. I was there for 6 weeks. Um, and my goal is to try to whatever knowledge I have to leave
Okay.
it in writing before I die, because I've been fortunate that I've had the ability to get into remote areas, to
Right.
look at parrots in the wild, to have kept and bred many species. That's something that a lot of the future generations are not going to be able to do.
For sure.
And at least if I can document what I have found, um, if the situations change and they can go and they can procure these birds and breed them, at least they'll have baseline data that they can go off of.
Exactly. And that makes perfect sense. And what you're doing is great work. Now, just thinking about everything you just said, I'm just curious, what do you feel is the current state of aviculture in the US? Would you say the hobby is dying, losing steam? What are your thoughts?
So COVID was a very unique situation for the world.
Hmm.
It brought in a lot of people into agriculture, a
Right,
lot. Some have stayed, some thought they could make a quick buck,
right.
some have left. But it has, interestingly enough, it has shown that minorities, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, they were a group that was ignored by modern agriculture. And yet they are the ones that dove in, that have stayed in, and that are showing this huge passion. Why? Because in many of the countries that we come from, and I was born in Cuba,
Mhm.
bird keeping was part of our culture.
Right.
It and we lost that sight until COVID said, "Hey, wake up! You have this history of bird keeping in your culture," and I've seen it from around the world. And the vestiges of it as you travel through Asia or Latin America or even Africa, the Middle East.
Hmm.
Bird keeping is a thriving hobby. Never would I have thought that some of the greatest collections in the world would be built in Asia or in the
Yeah,
Middle East.
absolutely. And that makes sense. And I like how you mentioned COVID because I feel like once COVID hit, there was a huge resurgence in aviculture. But another thing was the prices also skyrocketed along with the interest.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, do you feel that the trajectory that we're going, do you feel that the hobby will eventually be exclusive to the wealthy, just considering the prices
You
that we're
know,
seeing?
when you look at the history of aviculture,
Hmm.
It was always a blue collar worker that made the greatest contributions. Why? Because he took care of the birds himself.
Right.
When it becomes the hobby of the wealthy, you have keepers and caretakers and others. So, I believe that some of these people that jumped in will make a huge contribution because they have skin in the game. They want to
Right.
succeed. And that's very important. I think prices have to adjust. I think prices went
Okay.
crazy. When a green cheek conure was selling for $1,500,
Yeah.
that to me was just mind blowing. And a lot of these people overpaid for their birds.
Right.
Some of them have gotten rid of them. Some of them have stuck with them, and some of them are learning that, hey, I overpaid, but I'm enamored with these birds.
Hmm.
They meet the needs that I have for a pet, or they provide what I want in a pet, and then they've just jumped in and have acquired more and more and more. In the US, we have a difficult situation because we are seeing species diversity shrink.
Right.
At the height, we had 280 parrot species that came in numbers that could have been viable. We're down to about 37, 38 species that are viable that you could say enough are being bred to compensate for mortality, for attrition,
Right. Hmm.
and create new pairs. We have shrunk exponentially in the number of species. Things like citron crested cockatoos, Moluccan cockatoos, they're disappearing.
Right.
Um, the concept that these birds could be recycled from the pet trade, that people would get them and would eventually tire of them, has not proven to be very accurate because these birds acquired poor habits. They thought
Right.
themselves as feathered humans. They've not integrated back. And now there is this absence of all these species. And there's dozens of them that are on the verge of disappearing or have disappeared. You know, um,
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like myself, going back to your last point, I did overpay a little bit just to acquire some African grays because, like you said, there is a shrinkage in terms of the available, just viable birds itself. And just considering that, what are some species that you think we should pay more attention to just to ensure that we don't lose them in the USA?
so when we look at, there's still a handful of
Hmm.
dusky and bronze-winged parrots, yellow-collared macaws. Toucan and Amazons are almost gone.
Wow.
Um, some of these birds we need to focus some attention on. Um, Unfortunately, the few that are still being bred are getting sold as pets,
Right.
and that means that the next generation will have fewer and fewer birds to play with and try to breed.
For sure.
They're being bred successfully. Many of these birds are being bred successfully in Europe, where aviculture is not centered on the pet trade. The pet trade is something that has recently knocked at their door and has said, hey, the
Mhm.
birds you produce could be very interesting pets. Aviculture in Europe was basically two birds in an aviary in a yard. Here, aviculture was producing offspring for pets. So
Got it.
it's different. If we could import from Europe, we could replenish many of these bloodlines, but the process is cumbersome and it's made so difficult so as to discourage you.
Definitely, yeah, and I think, like you said, it is a really difficult process, not just to import, but also to keep certain species like the Congo and the Timneh were classified as endangered under Appendix 1, just like the hyacinth and the scarlet. So, do you think laws and rules like this help the birds in the wild, or what are
So
your
when we
thoughts?
look at the African grey, is a very interesting case because
Hmm.
South African breeders were producing 70 to 80,000 chicks a year.
Right.
They were primarily exporting. The minute the species was listed on Appendix 1, and it was done strictly for economic reasons, it was a way
Hmm.
to get people agitated. Oh, the birds are disappearing. The birds are disappearing. We need to protect them. But where's the protection?
Right.
It didn't mean that a poor African found a job. They weren't. They protected the birds, said, you can't do this. But we need to look at the people that live with these birds. They're the ones that need to cut down trees for fuel wood. They're the ones that are protein starved. They're
Right.
the ones that the birds raid their crops. If we could provide a means for those people to survive, then I could say, yes, protect them.
Right.
The protection is only on paper. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't stop the birds from getting eaten, trapped, sold locally. In fact,
Mhm.
work being done in by a group from the Doñana Research Center, they're finding that more birds are now being trapped than ever. They're just going to
Wow.
the local trade because the poor peasant will continue to trap, and if he can't sell them to an exporter, he sells them to a local person, and the birds get neglected, they die, and they're replaced by another one because they're cheap.
I see.
So
Yeah, that makes so. Mhm.
protection sounds good. We think it's wonderful, but does it really have an impact in on the species and in the local communities? And what ramifications does it have in aviculture? When they list the species on the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, it means that I cannot send it from Florida. I can't sell it from Florida to you, for example, because we would both need licenses, but they're not issuing licenses.
Right.
So, the politicians in Washington are against animal keeping because we're becoming more and more of an animal rights nation. And they discourage it. So what we've done is we've isolated populations. There's lots of blue-throated macaws being bred here, but they can't be sold outside across the state line
I see.
unless both entities have a permit and they don't issue them. So what's happening is populations are isolated, they're being inbred, and many of these populations will eventually disappear in a species that is not common in the wild, that is struggling and facing a lot of problems.
Got it. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just curious. I think about, when it comes to species that eventually may become extinct in the wild, what types of laws do you think they'll put together to restrict our right to own these animals? Do you think it will come back to us?
When you go through, and I'm working on a cockatoo book, so I've been doing a lot of work on Indonesian islands. When you
Hmm.
look at the number of islands that are getting clear cut, when you look at the explosion of palm oil
Right.
plantations, when you look at the numbers that were trapped, most of the yellow crested cockatoos, whether it be the subspecies of the lesser or the citron or even mediums, their
Right.
populations have crashed. Some of them are no longer viable. Many of these birds are here being readily bred in the US.
Hmm.
But again, the ESA comes into play, and you can't send them from one state to the other unless both entities are licensed. So
Exactly.
those species will disappear. We're not doing them any good. And the goal should always be to reintroduce some of these birds back to the wild once the wild exists or has been restored. And many of these parrots can live in cities. You go to Hong Kong or you go to Singapore, and there are wild cockatoos living in the cities. You come to Miami and there's blue and gold macaws. You go to Caracas or some of the cities in Brazil and you see macaws and Amazons. So the
Mhm.
birds can adapt, but will there be a population to reintroduce the birds to allow
Right.
them to adapt?
For sure. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I guess laws like this almost force a breeder's hand into hybridization in order to sell across state lines. So that definitely makes it very
It's
difficult.
which is a good point.
Yeah.
You can't sell a purebred lesser across a state line, but if you hybridize it, then
Hmm.
you can sell it across a state line. So you're encouraging what shouldn't be happening. You should
Right.
be hybridizing them. You should be breeding pure birds, and they should be traded. They should be moved around.
Right.
The ESA, the Endangered Species Act, was never intended for foreign species, and
Hmm.
like many laws, they were hijacked and
Right.
suddenly extended to areas where they shouldn't.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely a tough situation. Not sure what the solution could be, but we just have to keep fighting, I guess.
You know,
Yeah.
we need to encourage uh, pet people that are influential to talk to their representatives.
Mhm.
We need common sense laws.
Right.
We know that blanket protections do nothing. You need to have sensible protection. No one encourages, nobody wants trade in wild birds, but we should be allowed to import birds that are captive bred from
Right.
other countries, and we should be allowed to breed from those birds. We should make it simple. In Europe, it's 5 pet birds per year per breeder. They can go and they
Mhm.
can import. Our situation here is basically zero,
Right.
unless you have a breeding consortium, and they make it so difficult that it takes years to get approved,
Mhm.
and they go out of their way to not approve them.
Wow. Yeah, definitely a crazy situation. And it sounds like the breeders in South Africa are having a problem with getting licensed as well. Uh,
Yeah,
a lot of them have basically closed up shop just because they can't obtain the permits to
correct,
export.
correct.
So it's a mess for sure.
The largest breeders, the largest traders, and by traders, it's captive bred chicks that were exported worldwide, primarily to the Middle East, were the South Africans. They were breeding, like I said, 70, 80,000 gray chicks going primarily into the pet market in the
Mhm.
Middle East. When these birds could no longer be exported, smuggled birds started showing up.
Right.
So it stopped the legal trade that had basically undermined the wild trade, um, and it stimulated the wild trade. It got
Right.
people again to go out into the bush to trap, and it discouraged having um, people make a living from bird breeding. Many of the former trappers were hired by aviculturists to breed. When they could no longer hire them, they dismissed them. What do? They went back to trapping.
Right. Wow. Yes, it's tough. And just considering what you said about just the tremendous success that these South African breeders are having, almost 80,000 chicks. What do you think they're doing differently from what we're doing here in the US? Why do you think they're having so much more success with the African gray?
I think that so they went through a period where the prices crashed and it was not commercially viable to export. So they bred all these birds, they had them parent reared, they stockpile captive bred birds that suddenly reached maturity
Hmm.
and were had been reared as birds in flocks and groups, and suddenly these birds could be given a chance to reproduce. Here, what do? We breed them, we hand raise them, and we sell them for pets.
Right.
Many of these birds become so imprinted that they don't understand their birds and they just don't reproduce. The male is afraid to court the female. The female doesn't allow the male to mate with her. So we created the perfect storm. The South Africans faced a storm that actually allowed them to continue to reproduce from these birds.
Exactly. That's interesting. So I've heard breeders even say that, if you pair two African grazers chicks, that you may have little success breeding them as well if you just had two. Is that right? Do you believe
You
that as well?
want, you want to flock them. You want
Yeah.
birds to learn to be birds.
Right.
They're not a feathered extension of a human body.
Hmm.
Um, you want them to flock. You want them to understand lessons. In a group, there will be a bird that will become more dominant.
Right.
He'll be more bold. He will try new foods, try enrichment. Uh, so they have a leader that they follow.
I see.
When you have two pet birds, either they're very compatible and they only play with each other. In a group, they can interact and you can have birds that like each other,
Hmm.
bond. And these bonded birds are the ones that reproduce the best.
Okay. Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So, like you said, I guess the right way is to flock a group. Are you thinking at least three pairs within that cage?
Yes, 6, 8 birds, and they don't have
Mhm.
to be pairs. You could have 4 males and 2 females. At
Okay.
least you can watch that flock dynamics. You can see which ones are compatible, which ones are not. It's very important for birds to pair bond.
I see.
Um, when I started in aviculture in the 70s, in 1976, I would visit a pet store and he said, "Oh, macaws will never breed because they mate when they fly."
Right.
And uh, they had all these special requirements. Well, we know that that's not the case.
Hmm.
The introduction of surgical sexing allowed us to differentiate between birds that look alike. So
Okay.
that was a huge advance in aviculture. And I think then there were diets
Hmm.
that changed. The evolution of diets uh, reduced mortality significantly. 80% of the birds prior to the introduction of pellets suffered from some sort of dietary related issues. So as diets improved, so did reproduction. Unfortunately, we learned about flocking and lessons and enrichment way too late in the game.
I see.
And for many species, you know, it's 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 a challenge to get them to breed because they're birds that think they're humans with feathers.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. I actually had one African gray male that was hand fed and tame, and he actually bred, but I know he's an anomaly, and that doesn't
Yes.
happen very often. So definitely thankful to have a flock. But just curious, when you're flocking these birds, I know you feed the 70% pellets and 30% veggies. Do you still manipulate the diet while they're being flocked so they can experience abundance and also famine to go through the cycles, or is it just
Yeah,
one?
so, let's talk about why vegetables versus fruits. When we look at parrots in the wild, they do not wait for fruit to ripen because when they do, they compete with flying bats, with fruit eating mammals, with other fruit eating birds that are very aggressive. People see toucans, oh, they're very mild. They're very aggressive.
Yeah.
Toucans will challenge parrots and eat their eggs and chicks. So what do? They eat things green when the sugar content is very, very, very low.
Right.
That's why I don't feed fruits. Yes, you can use them as treats. I encourage vegetables. I always recommend vegetables. They provide beta carotenes and elements that they really need. They don't need all this sugar.
Right.
And then we provide enrichment. Enrichment is very important because it allows the birds to be mentally challenged, to do things that they would normally do in the wild. When you throw in a pandanus pod inside a cage, the birds have to work very hard to tear the pandanus. It looks like a pineapple, and then they tear off little segments, and each segment has a little seed. They work at it for days. It encourages them to do things that they would normally do in the wild. And in the wild, they experience feast and famine. Parrots nest at the end of the dry season because that's when plants have concentrated most of the nutrients. They don't nest when it's raining because the nest would get wet, the chicks would get wet, they would die, the eggs would drown, etc. And they do experience an up and down in fats and in proteins. We know with conures, for example, that if we reduce the fat and the protein, and then literally do an earthquake where we're adding a lot of protein, a lot of fat, we're
Mhm.
adding some moisture. Uh, for example, steamed carrots, steamed white, sweet potato, broccoli, etc. We trigger them breeding and we're doing what nature does. Suddenly, this seed has got all these nutrients pumped in because it's the dry season. The plant's
Right.
pushing some moisture because there's very little rain, and its survival. The survival of the tree is that seed. So it's packed with all of the nutrients, everything that's needed. That's when the parrots harvest it. And they harvest in about 30%, they drop, and then they germinate. So they don't eat the entire crop. They actually spread seeds throughout the forest because there's such parrots have a low attention span.
Right.
You see this. You give them a bowl full of food and they take one and they're suddenly eating and something happens and they drop it and they go to that.
Right.
So they drop seeds. The forest survives. This feast and famine is very important to encourage breeding. Now, you don't want to do it birds that are not sexually mature. You want to
Okay.
start doing this once they start reaching sexual maturity.
Got it. Okay. And when it comes to sexual maturity, I read in your book Culture, the newest version, I read that you had a Timney female that produced eggs at 32 months of age. So at what age would you introduce a nest box to a
So,
common African gray?
I would say with grays, I would introduce it at 3 years.
Hmm.
With macaws at 3 years, with Amazons at 2 years. We're finding that the story that these birds had to be 10 years old to reproduce is false. The more we breed these birds, the more we realize that they reproduce much younger. Um, so you want to, sort of between 2 and 3 years is the age that you want to introduce a nest.
Okay,
They initially begin to explore, and then you just don't give them a nest with shavings because in the wild they have to work very hard. They have to
right.
enlarge the cavity. So you throw in chunks of wood, and that darkness induces gonadal development. It gets the testes on the male to inflame, and the ovary begins to produce eggs.
Got it. And when you made a video about that exact topic, putting the wood inside of the nest, I went ahead and tried it for myself with my Congo pair that was laying infertile for 2 years. And after they were chewing at that wood for 2 weeks, the male mated with her successfully, and I had two fertile eggs. So it really put them
So,
to work. Hmm.
so what happens is that parrots have, like I said, a short attention span.
Right,
The male may be over here and the female may be over here. We need to bring them together. And he knows that she's not going to be receptive to breeding unless there's a suitable nest.
right.
So the darkness induces the gonads to swell. It puts the birds together, it brings them together, and it reduces the aggression. The male that may have all this pent up aggression in cockatoos, for example, where he may kill her, he may maim her,
Right.
suddenly he's got to focus on the nest. I've got to prepare the nest. So that's
Exactly.
part of why we do some of these things.
And is that mainly effective with like grays and macaws, or do you do with all of your
We
parrots?
do it with all birds. They
Okay.
all have to prepare a cavity, whether it be a termite nesting conure, and conures nest in termite mounds that are in trees, or a cliff nesting parrot that digs inside a cliff cavity. He's got to expand it. He's got to make it more suitable, or a tree cavity. They all have to work at it. Nothing is pre-made. Galahs, for example, even if the cavity is perfect, they take the bark off and then they rub powder downs
Hmm.
around the entrance. Why? Because they don't want varanids, which are these lizards, having an easy foothold, going in and eating the chicks or the eggs.
I see. Okay, got it. And I know you talk a lot about nest box size, and a lot of breeders in the U.S. tend to use bigger nest boxes. But is smaller actually better in your opinion? Do you feel that birds like that?
They like a dark cavity.
Hmm.
Uh, we were just looking at a pair of nesting blue and golds, and they were nesting next to an avenue. And there were two dead palms, royal palms. They picked the smallest one possible. And they do this because it's easier to protect it. If you've got a tight cavity and it rains, she can spread her wings and keep the eggs or the chicks from getting wet. Suddenly, if it's a big cavity, the chick may wobble
Hmm.
away and it's going to get wet and it's going to die. So they like tight, deep, dark cavities. It reduces predation and it allows them to protect the cavity much better.
Got it. Okay. And or do you have a preference between the wood nest boxes versus metal?
I don't find any difference.
Hmm.
Um, with a wood box, obviously they're going to destroy it. With a metal box, you need to put wood in there for them to chew. And if you could put a wooden base, that's even better.
Okay, got it. So also, I just wanted to mention your mentor Ramon Nogel, who told you to listen to your birds; they will talk to you. When it comes to African gray breeders in the U.S., what do you believe we're really dropping the ball at and not listening to our birds?
I think that we sold all the chicks that we bred,
Hmm.
um, and we didn't understand the complexities and the intelligence of the species. When when a male suddenly turns his back to the female, he's telling you, "I don't like her." So when you're recycling pets, you're going to need a lot more birds to put together and watch their behavior. And the story, about Ramon. Ramon was a Kardecian spiritualist priest.
Hmm.
I was like 18 years old, and I went to see and we went to his church, and I was born in the Caribbean, so I'm very open-minded, and I've always been very open-minded. I went, and he says, we're going to go to church, and the spirit takes possession of his body, and Maggie, buy the Reverend more birds.
Wow.
But man, this is really. I've never done drugs because I've always felt that life has been very enriching, but that was as close to a trip. And as we're walking around, he says, the birds talk to you. You need to listen. So I came home, and my grandfather was a highly educated man, said, maybe you're looking at things too literally.
Right.
Maybe what he means is they're not going to say, hey, I want Fruit Loops for breakfast.
Hmm.
Maybe what they're going to do is they're going to communicate subtly with you. And they clearly do. A bird turning its back to its mate, a bird spending time on the floor of the cage is telling you something. A bird that looks inside the nest and doesn't go inside is telling you something. If we just spend a little bit of time observing them, we will be successful.
That's great advice. I appreciate that. And I was just thinking back to when you first started building out your aviary, you were working with Congo grays and little Corellas, right? And I believe that was when you were breeding indoors. I'm
Yes,
just
yes.
curious. So with all of that, those powder down birds, how were you able to manage the dust accumulation and keep things?
So, I've always felt that the birds should be sprayed daily. When I bred birds indoor, we would put newspapers on the floor, and I would spray the birds every day.
Mhm.
The powder downs would get washed to the floor. I would pick up the papers and throw them away. 40 years later, I have severe sinus infection that
Mhm.
clearly has as its origin
Right.
those early years of breathing all that dust. And I'm allergic to birds. It doesn't mean I don't have them. I'm allergic to cats, to
Yeah.
monkey hair. I'm allergic to everything. I learned to live with it. In fact, I have masks
Got it.
that I
For
use
sure.
at the aviary. But
I had to get a mask myself.
it's the key is indoors is to spray them daily, keep the
Hmm.
temperature cool. The
Okay.
perception that we have, and I see this all the time. I see comments on Instagram and Facebook. Oh, the temperature's dropped to 60 degrees. I've got to provide heat to my birds. Well,
Hmm.
you use a down comforter. You use a down-filled coat.
That's true.
Uh, Birds can tolerate tremendous cold.
Hmm.
I've been in Siberia, and I saw macaws playing in the snow, and they had a heated aviary. They didn't want to
Wow.
be indoors. They wanted to be outside. And that experience I've seen in Scandinavia, across
Mhm.
Europe. I've seen that everywhere where the birds really have this impervious attitude to the cold. Where it's dangerous if it's wet and windy and their toes are exposed. If
Right.
they can protect their toes, they would rather perch outdoors than indoors.
Interesting. Yeah, that's
So
really interesting.
dropping the temperature makes it easier for you to breathe, and it keeps the powder downs from being so aerosolized, being in the air. You spray your birds daily, you clean them, and you can reduce the powder down significantly.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, because my two grays, they produce so much down, and like you said, I spray every single morning and vacuum just to keep it all under control because it can be a lot. So
Yeah.
I'm also curious. I know you're really big on hygiene, and that's really the foundation of how you keep everything in check here. So what cleaning solution do you recommend for indoor bird keepers for the floor, for the
So
cages, cups?
I like soap and water because
Mhm.
many pathogens have a lipid, a fatty covering. So what happens is unless you get rid of the fat, they're protected. They'll survive. So I like soap and water first, and then any disinfectant will work. Bleach, there's unscented bleach that you can use that works well. And you dilute it and you wipe surfaces down. And it's not only surfaces, you need to look at air conditioning and heating ducts. You need to look at walls. There's this spread of beak and feather disease
Right.
that's exploding worldwide. And part of the problem is people don't understand that virus will survive in dust for a very long time. So you can
Right.
keep your bottom of your cage spotless, but unless you get your floor and and your ceiling and your air ducts,
Right.
it's going to become entrenched.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. I guess that's where just quarantine is huge as well. Just really having a quarantine protocol. Yep.
Testing. People say, "Oh, it's expensive." It's well worth the
Oh
investment.
yeah, definitely. And you also use I forget the company name, but you do your cultures. There's
Yeah.
with the company in Miami, right? Do you recommend that for any
Yeah,
bird coming in?
so you always want to work with a local lab. Um,
Mhm.
I always work with a local vet. The late Sam Backus, the closest vet to me. I work with Danilo here in Miami with Susan Clubb. It's always good to have a relationship with a vet because four eyes can see far more than two,
Right.
and you need cultures, you need ideas, and the vets will give you recommendations. You're free to take them or not take them. But, often they can encourage you to see things that you may not be able to see.
Got it. That definitely makes sense. And I'm just curious when it comes to like administering medicines. I know you do a lot of that yourself. Is that really when it comes to? So
So,
how do you?
I've been at it for so long. I talked to the vet, for example. I would ask Susan or Sam or Danilo or whoever, "Hey,
Right.
we've got this culture problem. What do you recommend?" And based on sensitivities, it isn't going and taking something off the shelf and using it. There's
Right.
science to it. And then, I carry on the procedure. But I've been at it for so long that I have that knowledge.
Right.
The average person may not feel comfortable injecting an antibiotic, and oral antibiotics may not always work.
Got it. That definitely makes sense. And just wanted to switch gears a bit and just talk a little bit about weaning because I know you've been in the field, you've seen and observed, you know, over 80% of all parrot species in the wild. So I'm curious, when it comes to weaning, do parents in the wild deny their babies after a certain age, or do they feed them until they start to refuse, like hand feeders in the US?
They at one point I thought, and this is an evolution that has come as a result of the latest trips,
Right.
that uh, they overfed their chicks, and that then for the chick to fly, it would have to lose weight. What I find is that they deprive them of food to get them to come out of the nest.
Oh, okay.
Once they're out of the nest, then they continue to feed them, and that's where the lessons begin. So they don't, starving a bird will only get it to focus all of its energy into trying to attract your attention. We
Right.
need to feed them, but also encourage them to eat and things that are colorful and bright and juicy um, attract their attention.
Right.
You know, I don't feed colored pellets, but I do like to wean babies on colored pellets just because the red, the green, the yellow, the
Mhm.
blue attract their attention.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. And while we're on the topic of weaning, I'm just curious. I saw the study you did with the kikes, and you took two chicks and you fed one hand feeding formula at 9% fat and the other at 21% fat, and the difference in growth was massive.
Correct.
So I'm just curious. Do you believe that commercial hand feeding formula on the market today is insufficient, or
Some have inadequate amounts of fat.
okay?
Um, some have higher fat. I think that a company's always going to take um, the route of least problems.
Right.
So, if you have a 21% fat formula and somebody feeds it to a species that can't handle that, a cockatiel, for example,
Right.
there's going to be a lawsuit. We're lawsuit happy in this country.
Yes.
So what do? They find a medium 16, 17, 18% that works, and that's what they use. We commonly add additional fat. We add peanut butter, almond butter to the formula. And I like with species like golden conures, I like to start adding chopped up nuts. It helps them wean when it comes time because what happens is you're giving them all this liquid food. Well, that's not what they get in the wild.
Right.
They're in stuff. I remember the first time I saw a palm cockatoo, and the chick was that big, and it had a nut that big inside its stomach. I'm
Wow.
saying, "Is this going to ever digest it?" And it did.
Interesting. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I've never tried adding things into the formula, but it makes perfect sense. They need, real bits of food in there. I guess it
Yes.
helps with weaning too. Um, so I'm curious. I know you do a lot of experiments. Are you doing any interesting experiments these days?
So, Susan Club and I are working on some trials over beak and feather disease.
Oh,
We're
okay.
using some antivirals to see what happens because it is a huge, huge, huge problem.
Right.
And, many populations are threatened as a result. But we're doing some tests to see what happens. If you have a cherished pet, if you have a pet that means everything to you,
Hmm.
um, you don't want to lose it. I get calls on a daily basis. My cockatoo has been tested positive for beak and feather. The bird's
Hmm.
doomed in most
Right.
cases. So we're doing some trials on that and see how that works. And it's still too early, but it holds some promise.
Got it. Okay. And I'm curious. I know I've heard things like PBFD, seroconverts sometimes in certain birds. Do you see that happen with a certain percentage of birds, or are they almost all?
So we are finding that yes, some of them seroconvert.
Hmm.
Part of the problem with the newer strains is that it's jump species. It used to
Okay.
be African grays, ringnecks, cockatoos, eclectus. We're
Right.
now seeing it in Amazons and in macaws and in kikes. That's a threat.
Mhm. For sure. Wow. Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to seeing how the developments go with this new vaccine. Hopefully, things go well.
Yes, yes.
For sure.
So what we're doing is we're using an antiviral um,
Hmm.
that will hopefully stimulate the immune system enough where it works. And we have successes and we have failures. What we need to understand is why some species have success and some have failures. And that's what we
Got
can't,
it.
same birds, same tests, same everything. And some seem to respond and some don't.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to seeing how that all comes to be. I guess my last question here is a bit of a hypothetical question. So, if you had an unlimited budget and you had to start from zero, no birds at all, how would you build your breeding facility if you were looking to breed only African grays?
I would um, I would move to the south where the birds can be exposed to sunlight because grays, have a calcium issue. And
Right.
exposure to sunlight is very important. I would flock the birds part of the year, and I would set them up part of the year. I would
Mhm.
buy all the youngsters that I could buy and raise them in groups. Let
Okay.
them become birds. And if you can get some old wild birds, and there's plenty of them still around, add them to the group to teach them things.
Hmm. Yeah.
To teach them how to forage, how to behave in a group, um, perching, preening.
Mhm.
The way an African gray preens is very different than the way a cockatoo preens. If you raise those two species together, lots of confusion there.
Right.
You want the species to learn natural behaviors, and there's still some wild birds around.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's a great idea. Just introducing a former wild caught just to teach a few of the things that they've learned. Sounds like a great idea for sure. And I do remember an old article from Jean Pattison. Rest in peace to her. She wrote an article about how she stopped feeding produce and she just fed pellets and seed. And she said the health of her birds actually improved.
So,
What are your thoughts on that?
so Jean was a great friend, and one of our last conversations, I said, "Friend, someday we will meet again."
Hmm.
Um, so she comes from the time frame that I come from, where seeds were the primary diet. These birds had a lot of health issues, a lot of health issues. So when you took them off of a seed diet and you gave them pellets and you gave them some seed for fat, the results were miraculous compared to an all seed diet. And that's where she stayed. You know, um, I like steak, but I can't eat steak alone
Right.
every day. I eat my vegetables. So I look at it that if I like variety, my animals need to have variety.
Absolutely. And you're not a big fan of the chop or the mush diet that has been propagated a lot lately, huh?
You know, I have a lot of problems with the internet because everyone is an expert.
Oh yeah.
Some of us have spent an awful lot of time breeding birds, studying birds. Um, and I have people come along and say, "Oh, no, 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 that's wrong." How many have you bred? Where
Right.
do you see them? You know, when you look at wild parrots, they take fruit and they take one or two bites and they drop it. We
Yeah.
know there's lots of work being done by Pepe Tella and the team from Doñana, showing how important parrots are as disseminators of forests,
Right.
where birds drop fruit all along. Well, if it was ground up, they couldn't be dropping seeds along the way.
True.
You know,
True.
part of what parrots like to do is they have the zygopodactylus feet, which is like
Right.
a hand. The tongue is like a hand. That did not evolve for them to sit at a bowl with their head in, eating all this mush.
Yeah.
The foot evolved to hold food. The tongue evolved to turn things. Let's not take all the pleasures. Plastic toys don't grow on trees in the wild,
Right.
and mush is not available in nature.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
As I've gotten older, I've become just more stubborn. Where I used to, when somebody would say, for example, "Oh, I feed chop," and I would just keep quiet.
Yeah.
Today, I'd say, "Listen, you know, where did this evolve? Have you ever seen a parrot in the wild?" And you don't have to travel to South America. You can come to Miami. You can in New York. You can look at wild Quaker parakeets.
Yeah. For sure.
In San Diego, you can look at Amazons. Um, they don't eat mush. So I used to keep quiet. I no longer keep quiet about this stuff. I just,
Oh, oh yeah, you've earned that right.
it's I've done it, I enjoy. I was just in South America, and I climbed 8 hours up a mountainside, to get a good vantage point, and it's taxing. And I look at it that I'm 63 years old, so I gotta do it all now while I can still climb trees. And, when you see an Amazon flying across a forest and landing and, quietly walking towards the nest tree and then backing into the hole,
Hmm.
that teaches us a lot,
Right.
and that makes keeping these birds in captivity that much more fun because we can extrapolate what we find. And I always get to bring a souvenir. This was from, the canoe that we used, um,
That's awesome.
to get around water bodies. So it's fun.
You've done so much at the age of 16 and 17 that I still haven't done at 30. I always wanted to ask you, how were you able to do all that traveling as a young child?
I was very fortunate. My parents, encouraged it. My mother's fear was always that, um, I would be an idiot. So they encouraged, uh, my hobby. They encouraged my hobby. Um, my grandparents would help me. And I was very fortunate. My grandmother was in her 80s, and she would still come into the aviary and wash cages. And
Wow.
you know, um, when she passed away in her 90s, um, she had bad Alzheimer's.
Hmm.
And when I went to see her, right before we knew that, it was her last. And I said, "Grandmother, I'll always miss you in the aviary." And she reached up and pretended she was watching a bowl, scrubbing a bowl, and smiled.
Wow.
And, that meant a lot because it was very important. Family unity is key. And getting parents, relatives, cousins, children involved makes it that much more fun.
For sure. How do you think we further agriculture? I know, there's not as many young people getting involved. The conferences, it's always the veterans such as yourself speaking. There's no young voices out there. How do we encourage the youth to really
We 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 have, um like yourself, you're in social media, and that's the next generation. That's the way we can properly educate people. We can attract new people into this, and we can encourage, new folk to
right?
join. And, it when it was my age, When I was young, it was a bird club. It was magazines. Today, those things aren't there anymore. It's social media, and that's where it's the next generation. That's where we need to take it.
Absolutely, and I'll definitely be at the ASA conference this September.
I'm
I've
gonna,
never made it to a
I'm
conference,
gonna
so
try. The ASA AFA. Um, I was not sure that I could come. I was very I have a regular full time job.
oh yeah.
And I showed up, and I think I shocked everybody when I walked in and gave my speech. They thought I was going to do it via social media, via
Right.
Zoom, and I showed up. So I always try to participate in these things.
That's amazing, and one day I hope to be able to speak about African grays
You
once
will.
I
You
see
will.
what's there.
You've got the tenacity and the passion. And if
Thank
you have
you.
passion in aviculture, you will go far. And I wish you the best.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you again for coming on the show. This is a dream come true, Tony, and
My
thank you for all you do for aviculture. It'll be remembered forever.
Thank you. Anytime. That's what I'm here for.